If you care about me at all, you should focus on your problems, not putting the blame on me. So I won't pick up your call, I don't wanna talk about it. You know that we disagree. You always have to have the last word, don't you? Or you do things that you regret. Maybe you can find somebody new, somebody who knows just what to do.
Hey everyone, it's Stacy from My Petite Garden. Thanks so much for stopping by. So in this video, we'll be talking about my Peperomia collection and highlighting a little bit about the care. Surprisingly, this was actually quite a requested topic, considering I actually do not have that many Peperomias in my collection. I currently have a total of 5 Peperomias in my home, and to be very honest, I care for them all the same way as my other houseplants. I treat them a lot like my Hoyas because the type of Peperomias that I have are more of the succulent type, which seems to be what I lean towards these days when I pick houseplants to add to my home, because they tend to be less fussy and easier to care for. Because I care for all of my Peperomias in a very similar manner, I will highlight the care briefly, and then we'll go into the various types of Peperomias that I currently have. The soil mix that I use for my Peperomias is very similar to the mix for my aeroids and my Hoyas. It's usually very well draining, and the only difference is that sometimes with Peperomias I would skip the orchid bark or the cocoa core, and instead I'll just add additional pumice for drainage. But I've also used my regular Hoya and aeroid mix for my Peperomias before, and they grow just fine in it. Peperomias also tend to have very fine and shallow root systems, very similar to Hoyas, so I like to pot them in more shallow or airy pots if I can. That's why I tend to use terracotta pots, and as long as I feel like the root system isn't being overwhelmed by the ratio of soil to root, I tend to like to pot smaller versus going with a larger pot just because I want to reduce the chances of root rot. In terms of watering, right now I have a watering schedule of about twice a week or so for the majority of my plants, so my Peperomias will get watered during this time as well. I use just regular tap water to water my plants, and I keep most of my plants in terracotta pots, so I water them a bit more frequently than say if you were to keep them in a plastic or ceramic planter. I also sometimes try to gauge whether I need to water by the weight of the pot by lifting the pot to see how heavy it is, and depending on that I will know whether it needs watering. Also, something to keep in mind is that how often you need to water your plants will also depend on how much light they're getting on a daily basis. In regards to lighting, I don't find that my Peperomias require too much light to thrive. They seem to enjoy being in areas where there is medium to bright indirect light, and I personally prefer to keep them in medium indirect light areas. And I'll talk a little bit about where I currently have each of my Peperomias a little bit later in this video. As far as humidity goes, my Peperomias do not get any additional humidity aside from what it is naturally in my home, and to be honest, ever since we moved to our new home, I have yet to measure the humidity level here, but the plants seem to be doing fine. Just keep in mind that I no longer have any of the fussy plants that require higher humidity levels in my collection. In terms of fertilization, I currently use a slow release plant food nugget in the soil. For the ones that do not have this in their pots, I would usually mix some earthworm castings into the potting mix. I find this to be much easier to manage than having to remember to fertilize with my waterings every month. Lastly, I'll talk about pests. I don't find Peperomias to be particularly susceptible to pests. The only pests that I've had to deal with are mealybugs, and that was on my Peperomia zigzag. Other than that, I have not had to deal with any other pests on any of my peperomias. Okay, let's now take a look at the different types of peperomias I currently have in my collection. We'll start off with my Peperomia zigzag, or I believe the scientific name is Peperomia perisciifolia. It's a rather uncommon one as I don't see much information available on it, nor do I see it available for sale much, but it is definitely a gorgeous trailing peperomia. The foliage opens up like a flower bloom almost, and this is the only one of my peperomias to have ever experienced any pest issues. It had mealybugs not too long ago, but still managed to thrive. I gave it a few treatments of my Castile soap and water mix, so hopefully the pests are gone now, but I'll keep an eye on it. It currently sits on my east-facing bay window, so it gets a good few hours of nice morning sun. Next is my Peperomia quadrangularis. The texture of these leaves are very similar to the zigzag peperomia, where it's a little bit stiff but not as succulent as, say, the Peperomia hope. It also hangs by my east-facing window, so it gets morning bright and direct sun as well. If I had to pick, I would say this one would be the fussiest peperomia that's in my collection, simply because it does not like being moved around much. Anytime I change its location, it goes through a period of adjustment where it starts dropping its leaves. But it is still by no means a difficult plant to take care of. Some people tend to compare this to the Dischidia ovata due to the similarity in the foliage. However, the Dischidia ovata has much more succulent and plump leaves, and the shape is just a bit more oval. Moving on to my Peperomia kimnachii, a personal favorite of mine and probably the easiest and the best grower for me. The foliage reminds me a little bit of little succulent starbursts. It requires next to nothing and it grows really well for me. It sits again on my east-facing bay window, getting that morning sunlight. This is also one that I do not see very readily available in the US yet, so hopefully soon it'll be more common. Next is the newest addition to my Peperomia collection, the Peperomia pixie, or Peperomia orba. I've actually passed on adding this Peperomia to my collection so many times, but then I saw a large basket of it on sale at a local nursery about a month ago, so I finally decided to bring it home, and I'm really glad I did. The cute little foliage on this one has these tiny faint green veining, and it's constantly putting out new growth too. I have yet to repot this one out of its nursery pot, but I'll probably do it soon. So this will probably be the only Peperomia in my collection that you'll see is not in the terracotta pot. The last Peperomia in my collection will be the Peperomia hope, and this is probably the one that I've had the longest. I got this probably close to 3 years ago as a teeny tiny cutting. I've recently also propagated from this plant and the cuttings finally rooted, so I'll show you guys those shortly. The round corn-like succulent leaves makes this a very attractive peperomia, and I think it looks great as a trailing plant, or I've also seen some people who keep these as bushy plants and it looks just as nice. And here are the Peperomia hope cuttings that are now rooted. It took about a month or so to root, and I just rooted it in plain water, and I think I can pot them up pretty soon. This was my first time trying to root cuttings of the Peperomia hope, and it was also my first time propagating from this plant, so I wasn't sure if it was going to work or not, but it actually did, so I'm pretty happy about that. And that will be it for this video. I hope you guys found this useful, and if you have any more questions or have tips to share, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. And just a friendly reminder that everything that I have shown you guys in this video is just how I take care of my peperomias and what works for me in my home. So my best advice to you is to observe your plants and see what works for your plants in your home. As always, thank you guys for watching, and please remember to comment, like, and subscribe. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.